Hello, I'm Nathan Anaconi, software developer and machine learning engineer, and I'm here to talk to you about unboxing the black box. And that is this sort of $1 trillion question of how do we make these neural network models that are taking over the world more interpretable. And so this is actually a redo of a presentation I've given previously where it was abridged, but here I'm going to kind of get into the real details of everything. Um, so strap in and I hope you enjoy. So, neural networks are powerful and promising technologies, but it's really not possible to understand their inner workings at this moment. And emphasis on this moment. It's not in principle. There's no reason why we shouldn't or couldn't. It's just really difficult. And that's an important point. It's not inevitable. But these models become more powerful and integrated into society. It's going to become more pressing to the point of a major concern to understand how they come to their conclusions. Arguably, the inscrutability of these models really is their sort of only limitation. The fact that we can't actually reconstruct their conclusions does, limits their credibility. There's all kinds of potential benefits to unboxing the black box or making it more transparent. AI safety is a good one, so if you look at what OpenAI AI says about how it uh, prevents its models from telling people how to build bombs or whatever, um, the model will actually, it doesn't have an ethics. It'll just do whatever you tell it. And because these models are trained on everything, they know how to tell you how to build a bomb. Usually what happens is the output will be generated and then blocked after it's sort of classified as inappropriate. You can imagine if we could actually see the regions of the model that know about how to build bombs, we could actually just kind of patch it over. All types of pruning and knowledge transfer improvements and actually being able to dig in and sort of programmatically effectuate the model. All of this is possible in theory. Don't quote me on that, but so the point is we don't know until we find out. Identifying those centers of importance, and here's the real kicker, could allow us to sort of insert programmatic hooks, and we could sort of functionally update or modify these models in a more deterministic way. If we could get in there and see what's happening, in programming, anything you can identify, you can then reference, you can put into a variable, whatever, and then anything you can reference, you can manipulate. So if we can sort of identify the structures in these models, we can sort of put them in a variable, put them in functions, control the model more. That's the vision here. So why do we think of these models as a black box? Okay. So this is kind of the picture. I made all of these images, by the way. Sorry if they're not exactly the most artistic. Um, this is kind of the picture people visualize when they think of a black box, right? You can see what goes in, you can see what goes out, but you can't necessarily see what goes on inside, and moreover, you can't necessarily associate what inputs influence or what outputs, what their correlations are, their connection is causally. But imagine, God damn, sorry, I got a little mixed up there. Imagine if we could see what's going on inside. We could actually trace where the information went. This is just a kind of a schematic way of visualizing that. Um, so if we could follow the arrows, the input arrows through, we would have the model. We would have the reconstruction, the pathways that it's taking. If we just sort of tracked it, right? So simple, right? Here is a photograph of a recent. So while I was working on this showed up in my news feed, and I was kind of like, wow, something's in the air. This is from the Google Harvard collaboration, where they took a millimeter piece of a cubic millimeter piece of brain tissue, and they applied these machine learning techniques to create the most detailed brain structures, images of brain structures to date. And I recommend looking this up because they're really astonishing. The level of detail and differentiation you can see here is kind of unparalleled. But if they're doing that with real neural networks, which are way more complex than anything we've built, we should be able to apply a similar practice to artificial neural networks. But there's differences, and they're important. A certain point comparing them is like apples to oranges. But there's still something there, I think, on a low level that allows us to create meaningful analogies, comparisons between them. Um, but why aren't people trying enough to sort of unbox the black box? So there's a couple reasons I can think of. One of the main reasons is that the main focus is just getting these models to do interesting things. If they're not doing interesting things, who cares how they work? Only recently, have we got to the point where they're actually, you want to put these things in production in some ways. They're able to go out there in the world. So the money's still on, getting the models to do stuff. So, model explainability has really been focused on metrics about the model's performance and behavior, but not actually representations of the model. We're not trying to model the model, as it were. Also, there's an education problem. People are being told that, artificial neural networks are these impenetrable black boxes. Don't bother. We got other things to focus on. And it kind of just becomes this reinforcing loop where people ignore and just take it for granted, and it's become kind of a dogma that's not worth pursuing. But you can get a lot of insight. Also, just focusing on correlational or functional analysis between the inputs and the outputs. So, it's not like we have to know how the models work to actually build stuff with them. But the main reason is what you see here. You sort of hit this wall of numbers at a certain point where, you know, you just can't, it's not built for human consumption, okay? It's built for machine consumption, and it almost becomes, overwhelming at that point when you try to log out what's going on as these models are in training, and you just get hit with waves of numbers. So this is where I think comparing real brains to artificial neural networks becomes fruitful. Um, in real life, neural networks are physical, okay? So even though they're insanely complex, there's something there, right, to map. You can trace out something that actually is an entity in space and time. So nature provides like this explicit outline for mapping it. Artificial neural networks, though, just decompose into a mess of numbers. These numbers don't care about you. They don't care about being understood. They're encoded specifically for the machines to process. And we speak of a network, but that's really an abstraction. There's not really any kind of network going on inside your computer. Maybe this is represented a bit more concretely or actually with sort of certain types of chip architecture, but really we're just seeing matrices of numbers, just grids of numbers. Um, so this is the real trick. You have to impose the interpretative framework on the numbers. You can't just go crack it open and be like, oh, there it is. You actually have to build an artificial system for incorporating some interpretability into your investigation. But we know for a fact there are patterns in these numbers. If there weren't, if the system was purely chaotic, they would not be able to do anything, right? Because purely random numbers would not, be able to output language, semantic language, or do any type of perceptual classification. So much of this project that I'm going to tell you about in more detail is, now that I've sort of set the stage, is about developing a framework to uncover that implicit order in the numbers. Okay. So this is more about what I tried to do, and there are certain assumptions I made which I've since revisited, and in my sort of next drafts will probably modify. But one thing is, I shouldn't have to care about the model that you give the scanning framework that you build to interpret the model. Just like for a brain scan machine, it doesn't matter it's a sick, healthy, smart, young, old brain. It's an independent component. So I figured, the actual model I would sort of subject to experiment was incredibly simple. Just 20 input layer neurons, 10 hidden layer neurons, one output layer neuron. So basically 3 layers, binary classification, true or false. And so I really kind of went about this in 2 ways, which I think are connected but sort of build off of each other. So the first attempt was to really kind of reconstruct, while the training loop was running, these neuron activations, and to sort of reconstruct from those activations a kind of path through the network. So to help picture this, I like to use an analogy of a rat finding its way through a maze. So if you imagine a rat and you tie a string around its ankle, and you have 20 entrances to a maze because you have 20 input features, and 2 exits because you have 2 classification results. Ideally, actually, in actuality, you'd have 20 rats, because you'd have 20 input features, and you're trying to basically track the evolution of the input feature through the model. But let's keep it simple. Every time the rat goes through the maze and comes out the other end, you take the string that was on its ankle and cut it and leave it, and then you put the rat on at the start of the maze again, and begin the trial, the next training epoch. You take the rat, put a string on it, you put it through, you see what exit it takes. do it again, put a new string on, cut it. So you repeat this as many trials as you want, and then compare, where did it take its paths. And then you would basically take the strings that led to one exit or classification result, and you would group them and color them, basically color code them. And you would do so the same for all distinct outputs. Give them a different color, a different identity. And, like a rat, like a neural network, learns, in theory, it should learn the most efficient path through the network over time. It should converge on the most efficient path. So here's kind of a visual illustration. You start, this is a rat's path through the maze. You label that path. You take the exit, path 1, for the exit 1, category, and then you color code it, okay? Now, second trial, the rat takes this exit. Now you're going to color code that, label it, and so on for as many results, as many trials as you have, for as many input paths, for as many categorization results. And then you kind of find the sort of linear separation, the average that all of these paths through the model share. So, eventually you take an amalgam, cut away the parts that they don't share, and then you say, yes, this is the model's concept of exit 1 or exit 2. This is the neurons that are most active during this process. This didn't really work so well. Maybe I just couldn't figure out how to do it, but really the problem was we're not dealing with concrete objects here. We're not, there's no single pulse that just begins and ends on one side of the model. You have to actually, there's no concept of space, there's no paths. So we'd have to mathematically reconstruct this, and that's very difficult. So these traces became unmanageable, too much overhead. There was, I couldn't figure out how to reconstruct from these traces, history of traces, these sort of paths, even for a very simple model, even though I do think there's something to this idea. So then I sort of went back to the drawing board, okay? And this was sort of my maxim. In order for me to find the sort of points of change in the model, I had to identify what stays the same first, okay? What is the sort of substrate? And I couldn't stick to these paths of this idea of paths as much. The rat in the maze metaphor, we don't have a maze. So, what we really need, but then I noticed there's some kind of schematic form to all models that can be kind of reconstructed from the parameters. So they sort of decompose into a finite set of neurons, which are like zero-dimensional points. And those neurons, line up to each other in layers. And then, if there's enough of them, they'll eventually form a stack. And then those stacks become layers. And then those layers, during training, or during, the batch cycle where you're passing in data, happens over a fourth dimension. So this is kind of a schematic of that. This is your model. As you can see, there's 3 layers, 31 neurons, 100 epochs. It's kind of like a hypercube, right? A cube within a cube. So what I realized was, okay, so I can create, like a data frame from this. This is where I'm getting a little more technical. This provides me a ordered system for taking snapshots of the model. So here's an example of that, um, where you can see the epochs on one side. On the left, the layers. It's truncated here, but each neuron gets a label, each layer gets a label, each epoch gets a label, and then we're using tuples to enclose the weights and the referent. The first value in the tuple is where the input is coming from, and the second value is the weight value of the weight. So we're imposing that structure of which neuron is connected to its predecessor. So really, you get a nested dictionary here. This is like what I'm actually building, and then that nested dictionary, which is the product of this recording logic that captures data about the model, then gets cast into a data frame. And this nested dictionary, which is really kind of the core of my whole project here, is called the network trace. I'm not really tracing the neurons, I'm tracing the whole kind of superposition of the model itself. The whole network is kind of captured. So this, represents in a more schematic, in a more logical, abstracted form, the basic structure, the architecture of the model. So this is kind of what it would look like. It's supposed to be, we map out the epochs, the layers, the neurons. And the thing is, this is a lookup table, so you can look everything up and read and write to it just using the keys, okay? And you don't have to do, it's like you don't have to check every locker if you have a piece of paper telling you what locker to look at. So this makes it more performant. And you can really look up the state of a neuron at any point in its time, in its sort of training or inference activity, using just these keys. So as you go through this recording process, you can capture weights, biases, classification results, really anything, the basic statistics, and sort of put them on the sort of canonical form of the neuron. So you're sort of tracing these cross-sectional slices of the network, but you're also preserving kind of the average state of each neuron. So that brings us to the sort of the next stage where things get tricky. So I plan to continue this project, with the time I've had so far, is really just about getting me to the point where analysis and visualization is possible. But really, the magic is with this meta modeling. Recall the Harvard study, where they used machine learning on real brains to discover patterns. Now imagine we're using different machine learning methods on the network. On the data that we've traced, and we're sort of, it makes sense, because these models are really these numbers are sort of built for machine consumption. And here's an example using t-SNE, um, where I'm sort of trying to compare the similarity of the different neurons. And as you can see, there is, some structure here. Okay, there is something to work with, even though this is just, a skeleton, a start. So this whole area, of meta modeling is lots of potential here. Once we have that data frame, we can train any type of model on it, and we might be able to identify all kinds of patterns. So looking forward, okay, what are the steps? So obviously there are some pretty considerable limitations with this problem that are inherent to it. So even the small model I was using with 331 trainable parameters, there's tens of thousands of data points. So we get to really astronomical numbers if we were, training this on a, multi-billion parameter model. But that isn't to say it's impossible. I got all kinds of different ideas about how we might approach that scalability problem. Similar issues shared by, brain scientists. You know, the experts in the Harvard study, the Harvard Google study, analyzed a cubic millimeter tissue, which is about 57,000 cells, 150 million synapses. So this was, a grain of sand, and this was with a godlike Harvard and Google budget, with supercomputers, with, PhDs, and it took them a decade. Okay, I'm just me. No one's paying me to do this yet. So, if we were going to do something like one of these cutting edge flagship models that are, generative AI models, that would be like trying to model a whole brain here. We're in the infancy of this science. Doing so, though, what we're really doing is just writing down the numbers in a structured way. And the computers that can handle training these models can do this stuff easy. So I'm not too worried about it. There's all kinds of different things we could do: garbage collection, sampling techniques, principal component analysis. I'm not really worried about storage and time because, again, the computers that could train these crazy models, can make light work of just tracing, recording numbers. It'll be a lot of numbers, but whatever. So, plus I think I do have a sort of the lookup table design is, computer science fundamentals, the space and time complexity of hash lookups is very efficient. So, there's all kinds of different approaches to here. I want to publish a paper. I want to, or try to, I want to work on different analysis and visualization methods, benchmarks, etc. Another thing I came across was MIT came out with this neuron tracing and active learning environment, which is also, using machine learning to analyze brains. So really, I'm just applying this concept to fake, artificial brains, and trying to make like some semblance of a thing to actually interpret, kind of modeling an actual network. So yeah, I'm convinced what I'm trying to do is possible. It's not going to be easy. It's not going to pay off immediately, but it's doable, and I think I'm on to something. So if you were able to sit through this and would like to talk to me about it, feel free to reach out. So thanks.